In this video, we're going to learn about cells and their organelles. By the end of the video, you'll understand the difference between eukaryotic cells and prokaryotic cells. You'll be able to explain the difference between plant and animal cells. You'll be able to label an animal and plant cell, and you'll be able to explain the function of a variety of different organelles. As we go through this video, you'll be taking notes on either a piece of paper or on the handout that's provided to you. The handout's always in the same spot where the learning goals or calendar is. So we start off the lesson with just a little spotting the difference activity. You'll see there's two pictures here, and you have to spot the difference between the top picture and the bottom picture. And so if you pause the video and try this for a minute, you would have identified some differences. So for example, you would have seen here there's 2 coins, here there's 3 coins. Here he's dripping from his nose, and here he's not. And there's other differences. And then we do the same thing here. And so the reason we started with spot the difference activity is because if you can spot the difference between pictures that you see on the back of a cereal box or on simple kid games like the previous one we just saw, you can do the same thing here. So you can pause the video and try to spot some differences and similarities between these two cells. These are 2 cells. This is an animal one and this is a plant one, and there's some differences, but there's also some similarities. So really it is as simple as just understanding how to look for similar things and look for different things. As we go through the presentation, we'll learn about the main differences and similarities between the animal and the plant cell. We're going to start off with the cell theory. The cell theory is a way to explain all of biology in 3 points. And so the most important points we're going to see with the cell theory are that all living things are made of cells, that the cell is the basic unit of life, and that cells arise from pre-existing cells. So basically all living things are made of cells. If there's something living, remember the characteristics of life, it is made up of the most basic unit of life called the cell. That's the second point. The cell is the most basic unit of life. So if you were to take a look at this living individual here, and you were to zoom in, you were to look at the organism, remember that from grade 9, the organism, you were to take a look at their organ systems, like a digestive system, and then you were to take a look at an organ, like a stomach, and then you go in and you zoom in, you take a look at the tissues, and then afterwards you go in, you zoom in, and you take a look at the cell. That's the smallest part that's living. Everything else, if you go any smaller, it's non-living. Like an atom, that's considered non-living. So the cell is the smallest living thing, the basic unit of life. And this third point is that cells arise from other cells. So if there's a cell that exists today, it's because another cell made it. A cell doesn't just come out of nowhere for now. So these 2 cells here, they were made from another cell that split into 2. And then these could split into 2 to make more new cells. So all cells come from a cell that already existed before it. You can also watch this video to get more details on the cell theory, but these are the main points that we will need you to know. So we're going to start off by taking a look at what cells are, what organelles are, what the functions are. Cells in general, as we mentioned, are the smallest living thing. Cells, if you take a look at this picture here, you'll notice that even though they're the smallest living thing, they have smaller parts inside of them. So you can see here mitochondrion, nuclear membrane, nucleus, Golgi apparatus, cell membrane, centrioles. So the cell has smaller parts, and these are almost like the organs of the cell. Those are called organelles. They're smaller subcellular parts. That means parts that are smaller. Sub means smaller than the cell. And they help the cell basically do all the things it needs to do to survive, to do all its functions of life. So they're the tiny organs of the cell, which is what organelles basically mean. They help with removing waste, for example. They help with the cell to reproduce and to make more of itself, so to cell division. They help the cell to get food, to get nutrients. They help the cell to grow, to maintain itself, to do things like copying its DNA, its genetic material. So in this picture over here, let's hide that. In this picture here, you can see a cell, and you can see these are all the different organelles. So our goal is that we're going to go through this presentation and take a look at all these different organelles that are within a cell and see what they do. Before we do that, I do want to go over the organization of cells, how there's 2 main categories of cells. So if you look at a cell, you can have what's called a prokaryotic cell, and you'll see a picture of it here, and a eukaryotic cell. You'll see a picture of it here. The prokaryotic cells can be 2 other categories, and the eukaryotic cells can be a few other categories here. So what is the difference between the 2? Let's start with eukaryotic cells. Those are the cells that you actually have. your main cells. You do have other cells in you, but these are your main cells, eukaryotic ones. They're the larger, more complex cells. What defines them is really the fact that they have this little organelle in here called a nucleus. There's a case to it. It's called a membrane. So whenever there's a case, a container for an organelle, it's called a membrane. And so it has a nucleus with a membrane right here. And that's what contains the DNA. And there's a few other things that make it eukaryotic, but the point is that it's larger, it's more complex, and it has membrane-bound organelles, specifically a nucleus. And other membrane-bound organelles are things like mitochondria over here, or the endoplasmic reticulum, or the Golgi, or the lysosome. So those are all organelles with little cases that surround them. And then the prokaryotic cells, like you see over here, they're smaller and simpler. They don't have membrane-bound organelles. They actually don't have a nucleus. Here's the DNA of this prokaryotic cell, and you'll notice that it's not surrounded by a case, by a nucleus. It has a region where there's DNA called a nucleoid region, but it's not surrounded by a nucleus, by a nuclear membrane, like the eukaryotic cell is over here. There's different types of prokaryotic cells. There's bacteria and archaebacteria. And then there's different types of eukaryotic cells, as I mentioned. There's plant cells. There's animal cells. You fall into the category of animals, so your animal cells are eukaryotic. There's fungi cells. They're eukaryotic. So if you have ever seen a mushroom, that's actually not a plant. A mushroom is a special category of eukaryotic organisms called fungi. There's also protists. If you've ever had seaweed, like on sushi, for example, seaweed is actually a protist, not a plant, and it also has eukaryotic cells with membrane-bound organelles. Now, even though these are very different cells, prokaryotes and eukaryotes, there are some things that all cells have in common. And those things that all cells have in common are ribosomes. So you'll see this one has ribosomes over here. And this one also has ribosomes right over here, little dots. DNA. So DNA over here, not in the nucleus for prokaryotes. DNA in here, in a nucleus for eukaryotes. Cell membranes. So you'll notice that there's a covering over here called the cell membrane for the prokaryotic cell. And then over here you can see a cell membrane on the outside for the eukaryotic cell. So the cell membrane is basically just the case of the entire cell. Okay. And some cells have more coverings. You'll see prokaryotes have more layers. There's some eukaryotes that have more layers as well, but the point is they all have at least a base covering called the cell membrane. And they also all have this jelly stuff on the inside, this gooey, ooey jelly stuff that holds all the organelles, holds nutrients, holds water. It's like a jello, and that's called the cytoplasm. So even though eukaryotes and prokaryotes are very different from each other, they do have similarities, and all cells have these things: ribosomes, DNA, cell membranes, and cytoplasm. So our first step here is understand the difference between eukaryotes and prokaryotes. And so we saw that cells are divided into the category of prokaryote or eukaryote. Prokaryotes are simpler and smaller, don't have membrane-bound organelles. Eukaryotes are larger, more complex, and they do have membrane-bound organelles. In fact, when we first discovered eukaryote versus prokaryote, scientists were looking at the microscope and noticed that some of the cells had a little black dot in them, and they called that a kernel. It looked like a little kernel, like a corn kernel. It was a dark circle in the middle, and that was actually the nucleus. So they called that the eukaryote, which means the true kernel. And then there were some cells that did not have that kernel when they looked under the microscope, and they called that the prokaryote, meaning before the true kernel. So these were cells that did not have a true kernel in them. Also, in the picture, I lead you to believe that these prokaryotic cells, like a bacterial cell, is as big as a eukaryotic cell. There is a range, but this is definitely not as big as a eukaryotic cell. These are a lot smaller. It's just bigger for picture purposes. So in the next video, we're going to start exploring the difference between two specific eukaryotic cell types. So we have eukaryotes, remember the nucleus, and the eukaryotes can be either protist, plants, animals, or fungi. In grade 10, your focus is on plants and animals. In grade 11, you'll learn about all of these together with more focus on protist and fungi. For now, we're going to learn about plants and animals in the eukaryotic cell category.